The Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York stretch endlessly, a patchwork of dense forest, jagged ridges, and icy lakes. On November 15, 2015, the air around Brant Lake carried the sharp bite of late autumn. Trees stood skeletal, their leaves long gone, carpeting the forest floor with a brittle crunch beneath boots. It was the kind of wilderness that demanded respect, a place where even seasoned woodsmen tread carefully. That morning, a small group of 6 hunters gathered for what was supposed to be a familiar tradition. They were older men, lifelong outdoorsmen, men who had spent decades navigating this rugged terrain. It wasn't just a hunt. It was a ritual, a yearly gathering of friends bound by experience and trust. These weren't amateurs stumbling into the woods. They were disciplined, deliberate, and careful. Among them was Thomas Messick, known to friends as Tom. At 82, Messick was not the strongest man in the group, but he was respected for his resilience and his history. He was a retired military paratrooper, a man who had trained in survival under conditions far harsher than these. Yet time had left its marks. He had lost vision in one eye and his hearing had declined sharply, forcing him to rely on his companions more than before. Still, there was no hesitation about bringing him along. Messick belonged in the woods. The group's plan was simple. They would spread out along a ridge and push game through the valley below. It was a strategy they had executed countless times. Each man had a designated position, chosen for safety and efficiency. Messick was assigned to sit at the edge of a hill overlooking thick timber, waiting for deer to be driven his way. It was a stationary role, one that suited him given his age and limitations. He carried his rifle, dressed in camouflage and bright orange for visibility, and positioned himself where his friends expected him to remain. Nothing about the setup suggested risk. The men were within shouting distance of one another. They were familiar with every logging road, every trail, every natural landmark in that section of forest. In their minds, the Adirondacks were not a threat. They were home. The drive began without incident. The hunters spread into the valley, moving methodically. For nearly an hour, the rhythm of the woods remained steady. Then came the first sign that something was wrong. When the men regrouped at the end of the drive, Messick was gone. His spot was empty. No hunter, no rifle, not even an impression in the ground that suggested where he had walked off. At first, there was no panic. Perhaps he had moved slightly, shifted position, or returned to the vehicles early. The men called out, their voices carrying through the bare trees, but there was no answer. They expected the familiar figure of their friend to appear through the brush at any moment. Minutes stretched into an hour. The silence deepened. By late afternoon, unease set in. Messick had not moved far. He couldn't have. His health would have prevented him from covering great distances. Yet the woods, which had always felt mapped and predictable to these men, suddenly felt endless. By evening, the gravity of the situation was undeniable. A man with one good eye and limited hearing had vanished in terrain he knew well, without leaving a footprint or a trail. The hunters searched as best they could in the fading light. Their shouts met with nothing but the wind sweeping through skeletal branches. When they finally conceded that they could not find him alone, they called for help. Local law enforcement was notified, and the first wave of responders began organizing a search. The forest, quiet and indifferent, swallowed the last echoes of the hunters' voices as night settled over Brant Lake. What had begun as a simple day in the woods had turned into something else entirely. The start of one of the most baffling disappearances the Adirondacks would ever hold. You're watching Trace of Evil, where we reveal true crimes, unsolved disappearances, and mysteries surrounding crime. Like and subscribe to watch more episodes from our channel. Let's get back into the story of Thomas Messick. By the time the hunters realized Thomas Messick was gone for good, darkness had already begun to close in over Brant Lake. The Adirondacks in late November were unforgiving to anyone caught outside overnight. Temperatures dropped quickly, the air biting, the woods shifting from rugged terrain to a potential trap. The decision was swift: call for help. The first deputies from Warren County Sheriff's Office arrived before midnight. What began as a missing person report was immediately recognized as a situation requiring urgency. This was not a young man prone to wandering off, nor a reckless hiker who had ignored the risks of the wilderness. Messick was elderly, visually impaired, and hard of hearing. Survival through the night would depend on him having found shelter quickly. The next morning, the search began in earnest. Dozens of responders arrived: law enforcement, firefighters, forest rangers. The hunters who had been with Messick the previous day retraced their steps, guiding officials to the precise ridge where he had last been seen. That area became the center of a massive grid search. The methods were precise. Searchers fanned out in lines, each person spaced only yards apart. They combed the woods slowly, scanning the ground for any sign of Messick's clothing, rifle, or gear. Volunteers carried whistles, shouting his name at intervals. Trained dogs, leashed and restless, were led into the brush, their noses down, searching for any trace of scent. Helicopters circled above, their rotors chopping the cold air, scanning with infrared cameras for body heat among the trees. Yet there was nothing. No tracks, no scraps of fabric, no dropped rifle or hat. Not even the faintest sign that an 82-year-old man had ever stepped off the ridge. The ground yielded nothing but the ordinary signs of the forest: fallen branches, damp leaves, and silence. By the third day, the operation had become one of the largest searches in Adirondack history. Over 100 people were now involved, drawn from across the state. They searched not just the ridge but the logging roads, the trails, the marshy areas where someone might have stumbled. Divers probed nearby ponds, though the idea that Messick had wandered that far seemed improbable. The conditions were ideal for a search. The forest floor was free of fresh snow, meaning tracks or disturbed ground should have been visible. Search dogs had clear air to work with. Helicopters swept wide arcs. And yet, despite the effort, the forest remained mute. The men who had hunted with Messick were baffled. They had known him for decades, trusted his instincts, relied on his discipline. Even with his failing eyesight and hearing, Messick was cautious. He was not a man to wander. He had been assigned to sit, to wait, to hold position. And yet he had vanished as if pulled off the ridge without warning. Family members arrived, stunned by the news. Messick's wife and children refused to believe he could simply disappear. They reminded officials of his military background, his paratrooper training, his knowledge of survival. Even at 82, they said, he knew how to last in the woods. The searchers listened but could not reconcile those words with what they were finding. Nothing at all. As the days stretched on, frustration grew. Search leaders extended the perimeter, fanning out miles from the original spot. Teams pushed deeper into ravines, climbed steeper slopes, and checked dense thickets where a man could have collapsed unseen. Again, nothing. By the end of the first week, whispers of unease spread among the volunteers. An elderly hunter could collapse, yes. He could suffer a medical emergency, stumble, or fall. But even then, there should be a trace. A rifle lying across moss, a hat snagged on a branch, a scent for the dogs to follow. Instead, it was as if Messick had never entered the forest at all. Some searchers admitted later that the silence was the most unnerving part. In the Adirondacks, missing persons are usually found quickly, injured, disoriented, or worse. The woods, though vast, tend to give up their secrets eventually. This time, it held them tight. After 8 days, the official operation scaled back. Rangers and deputies remained, but the flood of volunteers dwindled. Exhaustion set in. Searchers had walked hundreds of miles, yet the score remained the same. Zero evidence. Not a boot print, not a broken twig. For the men who had gone into the forest with Messick, the retreat of search teams left only more questions. They had been there. They had seen the spot. They had called his name until their throats were raw. And no matter how hard they tried, they could not explain how their friend had vanished without leaving a single clue. In the Adirondacks, the silence was beginning to sound like something more than absence. It was beginning to feel like a wall. As the official search scaled back, the absence of answers only deepened the riddle. By December 2015, weeks after Thomas Messick had vanished, His case had already become something different from an ordinary missing persons file. It was now a mystery without precedent in the Adirondacks. News outlets began covering the story in detail. Messick was not just another hiker lost to the mountains. He was a decorated veteran, an 82-year-old paratrooper whose training had once been rooted in survival. The contrast between his capabilities and his vanishing unsettled the public. The idea of a man his age wandering for miles seemed implausible. If he had collapsed near his assigned position, searchers should have found him within hours. The complete void of evidence became the story itself. Family interviews reinforced the sense of impossibility. Messick's wife, Beverly, described him as steady and careful, someone who would not panic if disoriented. His son, also named Thomas, pointed to his father's discipline. Even in diminished health, he would have stayed put if he had lost his bearings. The family could not accept the idea that he had simply walked off into the woods. To them, it felt like something else had intervened. Law enforcement, however, remained bound by procedure. The Warren County Sheriff's Office released limited statements, acknowledging the scale of the search but offering no theories. Behind the scenes, investigators reviewed every possibility: medical emergency, animal attack, even foul play. Yet each option failed to align with the evidence, or rather, the lack of it. If Messick had suffered a heart attack or stroke, his body would have been discovered within the search perimeter. The grid had been tight enough that nothing larger than a squirrel should have been overlooked. If a bear or other predator had attacked, traces would have been visible: blood, torn clothing, drag marks. Search dogs trained to locate remains should have reacted to something. Instead, they had found nothing. The possibility of foul play raised still more questions. Messick had not been alone. He had been within shouting distance of his companions. To abduct or harm him in that setting would have required extraordinary speed and silence. None of the hunters reported hearing a struggle, a cry, or even an unusual noise. For a man hard of hearing and partially blind, Messick could not have resisted much. But his disappearance occurred in a window of time so narrow that it bordered on unexplainable. As the case lingered, theories multiplied outside official channels. Some pointed to the terrain itself. The Adirondacks are vast, with thick undergrowth, sinkholes, and hidden waterways. It was possible, some suggested, that Messick had stumbled into a ravine or fallen into water, his body concealed by the environment. Yet again, the counterpoint stood. The dogs, the divers, the helicopters had found nothing. Others turned toward more unconventional ideas. Online forums compared Messick's disappearance to other strange vanishings in national forests across the United States. Patterns were drawn: experienced outdoorsmen disappearing without trace, no evidence left behind, massive searches yielding nothing. Theories ranged from clandestine abduction to the far stranger, invoking the folklore of the Adirondacks. Lights in the woods, sudden silences, events that defied explanation. Within the community of Brant Lake, unease lingered. Locals had grown up with the wilderness at their doorstep, confident in their ability to read it. The disappearance unsettled that confidence. If a man could vanish without a footprint, what did that say about the safety of their own routines: hunting, hiking, fishing in the same forests? Conversations grew hushed. Parents warned children not to wander. The woods, once seen as familiar, now carried a sharper edge. For the men who had been with Messick that day, the mystery cut deeper. They had replayed the events countless times. The ridge, the positions, the moment they regrouped and realized he was gone. Each man was certain of what he had seen, or rather, what he hadn't. There was no sign of Messick moving, no visual of him walking off, no sound of a misstep. Their collective testimony was as unnerving as the absence of evidence. The case began drawing comparisons to the concept of silent disappearances, a term sometimes used to describe situations where no trace of a missing person is ever found. In such cases, it is not merely the absence of a body, but the absence of any disturbance, as if the person had been lifted out of reality entirely. Messick's story seemed to fit the mold too neatly, and that, in itself, was frightening. By the end of the winter, with snow now blanketing the ridge and trails, the likelihood of discovery dwindled. If Messick had been out there, the elements would have concealed him further. Search teams returned in smaller numbers, checking again as spring approached, but each attempt ended with the same emptiness. What remained were questions. More than the forest, more than law enforcement, more than even the family could answer. The disappearance of Thomas Messick had moved beyond the boundaries of ordinary investigation. It had become an event whispered about in forums, studied by true crime enthusiasts, and cataloged alongside the most baffling vanishing cases in American wilderness history. And as 2016 began, one fact loomed larger than all others. No matter how many hours, miles, or resources were poured into Brant Lake, Thomas Messick was nowhere to be found.